welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karyn Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich, online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today we have a special interview to celebrate reaching 50 episodes of this series on Chinese philosophy. So I'm joined by podcast co-host Karyn Lai. Hello, Karyn.
Hi, Peter.
Welcome back to your own podcast. And in addition, we're joined by Bryan van Norden, who is James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College. He's, I think, one of the best people to talk about everything we've covered so far, which is basically Confucianism, Moism, and Taoism, because he's published so widely across all of Warring States philosophy. Hello, Bryan. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
So, speaking of the Warring States period, let's start with that, the historical context. We've said a lot about this already. We've talked about how the political, social disruption of the Warring States period helped to inspire philosophical reflection. And we've also emphasized that a lot of the thinkers we've covered were either political advisors or at least wanted to be political advisors. So I think we can take that all as read. I think the audience probably gets that by now. Is there anything else we should add about the relevance of the historical period for understanding Warring States thought and the emergence of philosophy in China in the first place?
I think you touched on this a little bit already, but one thing I like to emphasize with my own students is that there's this impression people sometimes have that philosophy is something you do when you don't have anything better to do with your time. And you just, pardon my language, you BS about certain topics because it doesn't make any difference. But the reality is that philosophy develops when people are confronting serious crises about human existence. And so in the seventh letter, which I think is authentic, but if it's not, at least it represents a view about what motivated Plato to philosophize, the seventh letter suggests that Plato was led to philosophize by his disgust with the corruption in both wings of politics in ancient Athens. And we're also told that Plato tried to realize his vision of government with the dictator in Syracuse. And Aristotle, of course, was a tutor to Alexander the Great. And, Aristotle says that philosophy can help you by giving you the target you're supposed to aim at in seeking for the good life. And so philosophy really develops around the world in response to a sense that something is wrong. And then people start to ask questions like, what's gone wrong? What would a healthy society look like? How do you live well in a society that either is functioning well or that is in a problematic state? And so in some ways, I'm looking forward to the next generation of philosophers because we're living in a time of crisis. And I know that somewhere among my students, or maybe your students, we're going to find the next Hypatia, the next Jacob, the next Plato, the next Aristotle, the next Confucius, the next Lao Tzu. So I think that's worth stressing.
Yeah. Karyn, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I suppose one of the things we should remember too, that during the Warring States period, as you'd expect across the world at that time, people were thinking thoughts and having conversations with others, writing things in China on bamboo strips and silk manuscripts. But the circulation of their views is not widespread by any means. So we can't assume that everyone around would have known what Confucius had said. And as you know, we have many versions of the Confucian Analects, for instance. So this complicates the issue quite a lot. I think it's got to do with the transmission of ideas, the sharing of ideas. And yes, I'd like to hear from Bryan how you think that affects our understanding of Warring States Chinese philosophy.
I think one thing we have to keep in mind around the world is that until fairly recent times, only a very small percentage of the population is literate. And I'm not just talking about China, I'm talking about the West as well. And there were periods in European history where there's a great book from a while ago, How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it's about the fact that there was a certain period in European history when there were a handful of monks in Ireland who were the last people who knew how to read Greek and Latin. And so When you're doing philosophy, you are doing a kind of reading of elite culture. But one thing to keep in mind around the world is that's what we have literary access to. And the people who are literate have a disproportionate influence on the direction that society goes.
Yeah, maybe it's also a little different depending on which school you think about. So, for example, the Moists are often seen to be thinking about the life of craftsmen. They use all these craft analogies. And one thought is that maybe they're a little bit closer to, as it were, the people than, let's say, the Confucians, who seem to be more elite. So maybe we shouldn't assume that all of the Warring States thinkers are elite to the same extent, although they would all be relatively elite because, as Bryan said, they can read and they can write.
Yeah, one hypothesis is that the Moist writings, especially the so-called synoptic chapters, the ones where we have, in most cases, three versions of the same chapter, were written to be read out loud because they have a kind of cadence that like would make them very appropriate for recitation. And so maybe they were designed to be read to people who were not fully literate. So that's a possibility. But even ironically, even philosophers like Zhuangzi, who in some ways are critical of the ability of language to fully express the truth, Zhuangzi is clearly a hyper-literate author. And he's like Shakespeare in the kind of the quality of his writing and his use of hapax legomenon, these words you only see in this one text. Again, yeah, all of these people, even the Moists, the authors are themselves member of a very small hyperliterate group, but that doesn't mean they didn't address other people. In the Analects, we have Confucius talking to common people and talking to people who are presumably illiterate.
So we're already starting to talk there about these schools, the Moists, the Confucians, the Taoists, are the three main groups we've considered. And we've warned the listeners in previous episodes that it can be misleading to think of them as well-defined schools with authoritative founders. But I've been thinking about this and wondering whether it depends which group you're talking about. So I think at one extreme, we have the Taoists. So as we said in the first episode about Taoism, it's not really even clear what Taoism means in this period. It's very far from clear that there's a group of people, the Taoists, who all have some kind of unified set of doctrines. At the other end of the continuum, it seems like maybe the Moists are a pretty unified group. They seem to recognize the authority of Mozi as a founding figure. And then I wasn't really sure where the Confucians fit into that. So, Bryan, do you think that there's a different extent to which these three groups can be considered philosophical schools?
As you've gone over in earlier episodes, Sima Tan comes up with this categorization of the six schools of earlier Chinese philosophy, and then Sima Qian incorporates that into the Shiji, the records of the historian, and it becomes kind of a canonical list. But it's really, to use modern language, retconning the tradition, rereading the earlier tradition. Now, we know from Han Feizi, he mentions in passing that there are 8 different schools of Confucianism by his era. And he's mentioning that to say, well, people say you should follow the teachings of Confucius. Well, which interpretation? There's 8 different Confucian schools. And we know that there are 3 different sects of Moism. And some people think that the synoptic chapters in the Mozi, these groups of 3 different versions of the key chapters, represent the versions of each of the 3 schools. That's possible, although a little speculative. But so for both the Moists and the Confucians, they care enough to fight over the proper interpretation of the founding master. So this could cut 2 ways. You could say, look, there's 8 different kinds of Confucians and 3 different kinds of Moists, so there's no such thing as a true Moist or a true Confucian. But you could also say they care so much about getting the master right. That's why they break into sects. And it's like saying the notion of being a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew has no content just because people disagree about what these traditions are. But so the Confucians and the Moists have a notion of a correct lineage. But yeah, the notion of a Taoist, Lao Tzu didn't know he was a Taoist. Zhuangzi didn't think that he was continuing the teachings of the founding master Lao Tzu. That's all a kind of later innovation. The school of names is not really a school. And I'd say the legalists, certainly people like Han Feizi, are consciously taking ideas from earlier thinkers. Whether that makes it a school or not, we could argue about. And the yin yang school, or the people who are interested in the five phases, Soyan, I think that idea becomes important very late in the Warring States period and really becomes more influential in the Qin and the Han dynasties. So I'd say the thinkers who are most clearly schools in some sense would be the Mohists and Confucians, with the understanding that they disagree among themselves about what it means to be a Mohist or a Confucian.
Yeah. So actually, Karen, can I ask you maybe to elaborate a bit on the Taoists, since that's what we've been covering most recently? Because so obviously what Brian just said is right about Zhuangzi. But on the other hand, when Lao Tzu appears, he's at least treated very respectfully. He's the Lao Tzu or Gao De Jing is quoted a few times. And the way that Lao Tzu appears in the text is not, for example, like the way Kongzi appears in the texts.
That will depend on how we take the Zhuangzi as a text. And most scholars would agree that it's very difficult to actually locate the person, Zhuangzi, who is the author of the text or sections of the text. Some believe that Zhuangzi had a big hand in the first 7 chapters, the inner chapters. And then the others, the rest of the chapters that belong to this text that we now call the Zhuangzi, many of them have been added later. The final chapter, for instance, the Tianxia chapter of the Zhuangzi, is definitely a much later bit of text added on. And we also know, of course, the Zhuangzi went through a significant revision by Guoxiang. Guoxiang notes that what he had originally as a 52-chapter text is now a 33-chapter text. So if you just work with numbers, you will think, oh dear, this text has been greatly reduced in the hands of Guoxiang. But it may or may not be so, because Guoxiang might have reorganized the chapters. He could have shuffled the material around. But the fact is, we don't know. We don't know what the 52 chapters are or might have been. You have scholars placed along all sorts of camps across this Zhuangzi text. Chris Fraser, for instance, would probably say that he calls each passage, what we call passage, a text in itself. I'm not sure I'd go that far, although I'd agree with him that it's difficult, not just for the Zhuangzi, but indeed for many of the Warring States texts, it's difficult to identify authors of particular passages. And I'm not sure that I could comfortably say that the person Zhuangzi was the author of the first 7 chapters of the Zhuangzi.
Yeah. Brian, do you want to take a
I'm
stand here?
Yeah, I'm a little more optimistic about reading the inner chapters, the first 7 chapters, as by a common hand. And you're right, people have gone back and forth on this, and I wouldn't claim there's a scholarly consensus, but I feel like the first 7 chapters, we have enough commonality in linguistic structures and vocabulary and style to think that they're by a common author whom we call Zhuangzi. But you mentioned earlier, Peter, is Lao Tzu treated differently from Confucius? Confucius is treated differently in different parts, even of the inner chapter. So there are passages in the inner chapters. There's only one that I can think of where Confucius is treated as a very conventional thinker who criticizes someone merely because they're disabled, and says like, oh, it says this condescending thing about like, well, even this disabled person comes to learn from me. And so that puts Confucius in a very negative light. There are other passages where, as far as a plausible view anyway, is that Confucius is the spokesperson for Zhuangzi's ideas. And so Confucius is treated as a Taoist sage. And then there's a third style of Confucius where I would describe him sometimes as a wistful Taoist, where Confucius will say, well, I'm not like those sages who can transcend the world. All I can do is appreciate, what they do, but I'm branded by heaven, and so I can't leave morality behind. But at the same time, he seems to admire those figures. You could say, I guess Zhuangzi thinks he's a follower of Confucius because he sometimes presents Confucius as a Taoist sage. And it's also worth keeping in mind, retrospectively, we identify this figure Lao Tzu as, well, he's sometimes called Lao Tzu, he's sometimes called Lao Dan, he's sometimes called Li Er. it's not clear Zhuangzi thought that. He might have thought these are names for different people. And so we can't always assume, because the retconning that there was a Taoist school of which Lao Tzu is the founder and Zhuangzi is the expositor, leads people to identify different names as referring to the same person.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, that does complicate matters. Let's now take the opportunity, since we're looking back at these schools, to look at some topics that maybe cut across the schools. So things that appear in more than one of them. And I thought of a few of these that I wanted to run past you, both of you. So one is philosophy of language, or maybe we want to put a technical term on this. It would be the rectification of names. And this is something that maybe we most associate with the Confucians, but we might want to also see the other schools as involved in. Bryan, can you first of all say what you understand that phrase to mean, the rectification of names, and then maybe say something about how this concern with language goes beyond what we find in the Confucians into the other schools?
Yeah, so when people read the Analects, the sayings of Confucius and his immediate disciples, there's different ways in which people try to give a unifying view of it. And so one common view, and this was more common a few decades ago, was to see the central idea in the Analects as zhengming, rectifying names or correcting terms. Another way that people read the Analects is in terms of Analects 4:15, the passage where Confucius says somewhat cryptically to one of his disciples, "My way is bound together with one thing," or "My way is threaded together with one thing." And then there's been a lot of discussion about what is that one thread that binds the way of the master together. But the other passage, the rectifying names passage, this phrase occurs once in the Analects, and then it occurs, there's an essay in the Shunzi named On Rectifying Names. And it's not clear what it means in the Analects. I've argued that the passage discussing rectifying names is likely to be a later interpolation in the text for a variety of reasons, one of which is that in the core chapters of the Analects, the term Ming, meaning name or term, that's actually not a common use of that word in most of the Analects. And so it's weird that you have this chapter discussing rectifying names in the Analects. And also, the disciple to whom Confucius is talking even says, "Rectifying names? What are you talking about? What does that even mean?" And in the passage, Confucius says, "Oh, you're boorish. How could you not understand this?" Which could be what is called in rhetoric prolepsis, where you know your audience is going to be, since when does Confucius care about rectifying names? And so you put in the mouth of his interlocutor just that concern to be swatted down and like, no, this actually is something I've always cared about, rectifying names. But what does it mean exactly? In the Han Dynasty, what it came to mean was that the way to understand the teachings of the master is through a careful philological analysis of individual terms. And Dong Zhongshu, whom you'll, I'm sure, talk about in your section on Han Dynasty philosophy, makes this kind of philological investigation central to what Confucianism is about. So that's how they took it. In a few decades ago, Hu Shi, this great Chinese intellectual, came to study, actually came to the United States to study agriculture at Cornell, but illustrating the point we were talking about earlier, he realized, what China really needs is philosophy, not, another person to study agriculture. We got plenty of farmers. We don't need me telling farmers how to farm. We need to study philosophy. So he changed his major to philosophy. He learned about Western philosophy, and this was in a period when the philosophy of language was central to Western philosophy. And so he wrote this book, The Development of the Logical Method in Ancient China, and that was his doctoral dissertation in English. And then he started to write a history of Chinese philosophy in Chinese. He never completed it. But this really influenced this guy, Feng Youlan, who also came to study in the United States and also learned about Western philosophy in the United States. And Feng Youlan went back to China and wrote this complete history of Chinese philosophy. And then there was a guy named Dirk Body, who was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, translated Feng Youlan's history of Chinese philosophy into English. And it became the best-selling history of Chinese philosophy in the English-speaking world. Now, why? It's an interesting book, but I think people read Body's translation of Feng because they say, oh, I want a Chinese perspective on Chinese philosophy, and this is by a Chinese author. But ironically, Feng Youlan was interpreting Chinese philosophy through the lens of Western philosophy. And because philosophy of language, and in particular a kind of Russellian Platonism, were dominant when he was in graduate school in the United States, he went back and he interpreted Chinese philosophy in terms of the philosophy of language and a kind of Platonism. So he reads the school of name as basically a Chinese version of Platonism. He reads Neo-Confucianism as a version of Platonism, and he makes the philosophy of language, with rectification of names being the slogan for that, as central to Chinese thought. So I think that's why people got it into their head that, rectification of names is really central to Chinese thought. But clearly the philosophy of language is something that was central to Chinese philosophy, and probably rectification of names it's related to that. It's like a peripheral phenomenon in that debate. And what people noticed was the kind of things you start to notice in any philosophical tradition, which is that language is complicated. And sometimes philosophical issues either get obscured by language, or you might even think that they're resolved by understanding language in the right way. And so again, the school of names, as we pointed out, it's not an organized school, but you get these thinkers like Gongsun Lungzi saying that, white horses are not horses. And there's a lot of debate, as I'm sure you're aware, about whether the school of names is just sophistical. Are they, like Gorgias in the sophistical movement, like, I'll argue for anything you want me to argue for. You want me to argue that white horses are not horses? No problem, I'll do it. Or are they more like Protagoras in the sophistical movement, where this guy's a sophisticated thinker, even if he's controversial? And I used to think that when, Gong Song Lung said white horses are not horses, I used to think, well, that's just a sophistry, it's not important. But then I recently had occasion to translate his essay on reference. It opens with a really interesting line. It says, everything is something you can refer to, but reference is not something you can refer to. So everything in the world is something you can refer to except reference.
Wow.
And then he goes on to say these really paradoxical claims. And I think the point of them is that there's no way to fix the reference of terms because you already have to be using reference in order to refer to anything. And so there's no way outside of language to definitively fix the reference, which is a point that both Quine and Wittgenstein in different ways would make 2,000 years later. I always like to say the great thing about Chinese philosophy is, Western philosophy catches up to it 2,000 years later.
Yeah.
So on the philosophy of language, I think that's often true. So I think what the School of Names was onto is that you can't definitively fix the reference of terms. And the reason that's so important is you can't definitively fix the reference of terms like filial piety or benevolence or righteousness, because you already have to assume a language and its referential apparatus before you can try to further specify what the reference of terms are. And so I think people like Xunzi, in his essay on rectifying names, that's part of what he's wrestling with. And he tries to solve that problem by saying, look, you just stipulate what the reference of terms are at the beginning, and then you follow the reference established by the Sage Kings, and that'll solve the problem of reference. So they certainly were interested in the philosophy of language, and I think it was very important in ancient China. But I think phrasing it in terms of rectifying names, or thinking rectifying names is this master concept, that's the result of Hu Shi and Feng Youlan making it central to debates. And it's just as a reference, I discuss this in detail in my book, Virtue, Ethics, and Consequentialism in Early Chinese Philosophy, in the section on Confucius and the Analects.
Consequentialism being, by the way, something else that Chinese philosophy got to about 2,000 years earlier than European
Exactly.
philosophy.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and Karyn, you're really very much on the side of thinking that this stuff wasn't just sophism and playing around with words, like you always are very keen on emphasizing that there's really serious philosophical considerations behind it, right?
Questions about the philosophy of language are incredibly complex, and the early Chinese thinkers would have known that too. They asked many difficult and some quite sophisticated questions about language, just like the ones you've mentioned, Brian. However, I feel that many of their questions were left unanswered, perhaps because it was too difficult for them to work through, or because these were questions for which there are no straightforward answers. This reminds me of the nature of philosophical thinking. As we know, doing philosophy involves many different activities, and one of them consists in reflecting deeply and raising critical questions without also necessarily seeking that one correct answer. And this reminds me of Russell's The Problems of Philosophy. I wonder if the early Chinese thinkers were stuck on some of the problems, partly because there just aren't answers to at least some of the ones they raise. What do you think, Brian?
I think Rumpfel's Problems of Philosophy is an interesting example. I teach that work fairly regularly, and what strikes me is Russell's trying to give a foundationalist account of knowledge. I mean, he's not saying, oh, we don't really know what the answers are. On the contrary, he's saying, oh, no, there are absolute foundations of knowledge. There are things you're acquainted with, both in sensory experience, and then there are abstract facts you're acquainted with, and this is a foundation we can build up from. I think we don't usually find something foundationless like that in the Chinese tradition, but I think we find three broad approaches after what Angus Graham called the language crisis of the 4th century BCE. On the one hand, you have the Mohists, and in something called the dialectical chapters, they attempt to address the problems in reference that are raised by the school of names and also, I think, by some of the Taoists. And it's a lot like analytic philosophy. They try to say, well, look, we can diffuse these paradoxes if we're careful enough about how we use language. We just have to be really careful about what we're saying and really careful about what we mean. And so we just have to fix what our terms mean at the beginning of the discussion, and then we'll be able to proceed without paradox. Then on the other hand, you get the Taoists, and I think the Taoists embrace the paradox. So again, Gongsun Lungzi says white horses are not horses, and the Tao Te Ching attributed to Lao Tzu opens with ways can be put into words, but they're not going to be constant names. Names can be named, but they're not going to be constant names. And so I think there's a real kind of similarity here, a belief that, well, you might think, well, names are names, like, but, they're not fixed. And so that suggests that truth is somehow beyond language, which, I mean, arguably is a way of reading Wittgenstein, and which that's what Wittgenstein's, at least suggesting in works like the Tractatus as well. And I pointed out, and many other people have pointed out, that there's a weird way in which the ending of the Tractatus, where Wittgenstein says, everything I've said is just like a ladder that you have to use to climb somewhere and then you throw it aside, is a lot like when Zhuangzi says the fish trap is to get the fish. Once you got the fish, you can forget the fish trap. Words are for meaning. Once you've got the meaning, you can forget the words. And then Wittgenstein ends the Tractatus by saying, whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must be silent. And the Tao Te Ching says, those who know do not speak, those who speak do not know. So you have the Mohists saying, well, if we're precise about language, we can get our way around all these problems. The Taoists, or at least figures like Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu, saying, embrace the paradox. Truth is beyond language. That's the lesson to be learned from this. And I think, again, Xunzi gives an interesting response to this in his essay on rectifying names. But in general, I think the Confucian response is you don't argue with people who aren't serious about what they're talking about. And the Confucians think most of the people who are producing these paradoxes are not really serious about what they're arguing about, so we don't have to engage them.
Okay. One other question I wanted to ask about a topic that kind of cuts across schools is wu-wei, or non-action. So this is something we definitely found in Taoism. So we did a whole episode about wu-wei in the Lao Tzu. And it's also something that appears in Confucianism, not so much in Mohism. And again, I just wanted to ask if you could compare the way that wu-wei turns up in these two quote unquote schools.
Yeah, that's a great question. My friend and colleague, Edward Slingerland, has written several books about the notion of wu or non-action. And one of the things he points out is that although sometimes people are tempted to say that non-action is a Taoist notion, actually, perhaps the earliest reference to it is in the Analects of Confucius. The term comes up there. And Ted argues that although the term doesn't occur very often in Confucian texts, if you look carefully at the metaphors Confucians use, it's clear that it's a central concept for them as well. So if we think of non-action as non-self-conscious action, action that is spontaneous but appropriate for the situation. And so an example I use with students are things like touch typing. And so maybe the most useful course I took in high school was a typing course. And so if I can easily type, but if you ask me, where is the pinky on your left hand? What letter is it over? I have to look because I just don't remember. But I can easily produce, I guess it's an A. I'm looking at my keyboard now. I can produce an A in typing. That's wu or non-action. If you know how to play a guitar or the piano, you start out very self-consciously producing notes and chords, but then you do it spontaneously and you don't even think about how your fingers are moving. So these are some everyday examples of spontaneous, non-self-conscious, but appropriate for the situation action. Now, if you think about it that way, the highest state for both Confucians and Taoists is non-action. So Confucius says that when he was 70, he could finally follow his heart's desires without overstepping what is right. And so that sounds like non-action. And the Taoists want to do that too. Part of the substantial disagreement is, what does it look like to be a person who engages in non-action? Like, what does that person look like, and how do you get there? And one way of reading the Tao Te Ching attributed to Lao Tzu is that the effort to self-consciously become virtuous is self-undermining and self-defeating. And the way I motivate this with my students is I say, think about people you know who talk a lot about integrity and family values, honesty. 9 times out of 10, those people turn out to be nauseating hypocrites. And you're like, and so the Tao Te Ching would say, told you so. Have to work at becoming virtuous. The self-conscious thought, I'm going to be more virtuous than other people, is going to be self-undermining. And the Confucians recognize that that's a danger, but they say, yeah, that's a danger. And so you have to be on your guard against that. But how else do you become virtuous? And there are different ways people read the Tao Te Ching, but one way of reading it is to say, well, we're just going to have a simple, primitive society, and the idea of being a bad person will not occur to anybody, so that we won't make invidious comparisons between people based on who's smarter or who's more educated or who's more virtuous. We won't make a big deal out of being rich or beautiful or tall or whatever the criteria are, and that'll lead people to not compete. I've always found that a charming but unrealistic ideal. One way of reading the Zhuangzi is, Zhuangzi suggests, I think, well, you are going to have to engage in self-conscious action to achieve non-action. And so the butcher who skillfully carves up the ox, just spontaneously following the tianli, the heavenly pattern of the ox, as he cuts it apart, and doing it so well that his blade never dulls, that sounds like somebody who's achieved non-action through a process of self-conscious action. So then you might say, oh, but so then what's the difference between Confucians and Taoists? And there have been Taoists and Confucians who have said there isn't a difference between Confucians and Taoists. At the highest level, Confucius is the greatest Taoist sage because he fully embodies spontaneous action, whereas Lao Tzu is a lower level of sage because, ironically to us, he talks so much about, what the Tao is. And that's not how we think of the Tao Te Ching, but there have been Confucians and Taoists who said, yeah, ultimately these guys are saying the same thing. I think there is a difference, but I think in part it's that on my reading of Zhuangzi, he wants you to transcend ordinary human commitments and values. And so you use self-conscious actions to transform yourself into the kind of person who no longer takes seriously ordinary human values and commitments. Whereas the Confucians think that when you've totally embodied non-action, you are fully committed to virtue, but so fully committed to it, you don't have to think about it. And I've been going on for a while, but to give one more example, the example I give with my students is I say, look, I'm very far from being any kind of sage of any type. But in one respect, I have achieved non-action on virtue. What's that? I know where the petty cash is kept in the philosophy department office, and I know what the code is to the safe it's in. I am not tempted at all by the possibility of stealing that petty cash, although in point of fact, I would get away with it because I could do it and no one would expect, oh, it's probably the James Monroe Taylor Chair in philosophy who stole the petty cash. They blame the administrative assistant, they blame a student who works in the office. I'd be the last person they accept. But for whatever reason, I am not tempted at all to do that. So my unwillingness to steal the petty cash in the philosophy department office, despite the ease of doing it, is, in a way, for me, it's non-action. In a way, it's not, because obviously I've thought about it.
Yeah, I was just
But
going
on
to
the other
say,
hand, I'm not tempted by it at all. So in that respect, you say, but you're not
yeah,
tempted. So
yeah.
it's all you need to do.
I'm also imagining like someone steals the petty cash and then someone's listening to this podcast and they're like, wait a minute.
Yeah, I blew my
You
cover.
outed yourself.
Another
Yeah.
reason I can't do it. I blew
Yeah.
my cover in this podcast.
Karen, do you want to add something about the contrast between the Taoists and the Confucians on Wu?
I suppose there is another significant understanding of, in particular, Taoist Wu Wei that perhaps makes it quite different from how one thinks about the Confucian project. And this relates to Wu Wei as an attribute of a ruler, say. So you're a ruler, how do you exercise Wu Wei? It's not merely in being spontaneous and letting things be and responding in the moment. It's also, at least in part, pulling back on deciding on behalf of people how they should live their lives. So there is that meaning of Wu Wei, reading the way as artifice, imposing on the people what you think is the best life for them. And if you cast Wu Wei that way, the Confucian and Taoist visions will turn out quite different.
Mhm. Yeah, that all that stuff in the Lao Tzu about not having desires that you're pursuing. If you connect that to, I think we even made this point that it's extremely unlike the Moists, who really like have this sort of menu of targets that the ruler is supposed to be pursuing, and they should relentlessly pursue those targets. And once they get there, they stop, right, doing what they're doing. So at that point, they become non-active. But it's very like means end kind of reasoning in Moism, whereas that doesn't seem to be the case in the Lao Tzu.
And it's interesting because if you look at the history of Western ideas, there are some ways in which Chinese thought has influenced Western thought, and one of them is in the development of laissez-faire economics. And one of the founders of laissez-faire economics actually cited the notion of wu non-action, from the Analects. And I think it was the example of, it's either Yao or Shun, and said, yeah, the Chinese had it right. And so what you should do is not interfere in natural processes. Now, again, it seems, given how laissez-faire economics and capitalism has worked in the West, it might seem surprising to see a link between that and the kind of political philosophy and the sort of state that the Tao Te Ching advocates. But there was genuinely a way in which the notion of wu or non-action, meaning non-interference in natural processes, was identified explicitly as an inspiration for the development of laissez-faire economics in the West.
Amazing. Maybe I can squeeze in one more kind of cross school idea because I think this is an interesting one because it's really in all three of the schools. So Confucianism, Taoism, and Moism. And this is the idea of emulating heaven. And it connects to what we were just talking about. So when the Taoists, for example, say why you should be non active, so why you should engage in Wu Wei, they give these analogies to what the ruler ought to do and what nature does, right? So nature doesn't care. It just lets all these processes unfold, right? Without attending to all the little details or paying heed to what's going to happen, right? So it just lets the rain fall. It's not trying to get some farmer's crops to grow, right? It's just letting rain fall because that's what it does. And similarly, the Confucians and the Moists will appeal to heaven as a kind of standard for action. And I think that's a very interesting idea. There's a lot of different aspects to it, right? So you can think about it in terms of like maybe even a kind of divine command theory. In the case of the Moists, right? The reason why our ethics is correct is because heaven dictates it. Or you might think of it as just a kind of background assumption that nature is somehow normative or so on. But I think it's really striking that it cuts across all of these intellectual boundaries and that everybody agrees on at least one thing, namely emulate heaven. Whether they agree what heaven is another matter.
Yeah, so heaven is clearly an important concept in a way for all these early thinkers, although they interpret it in different ways. And there's some dispute about what the original meaning of the concept was. It certainly later in the tradition, in part due to the influence of Buddhism, we get the notion of Tiantang, the halls of heaven, which is a place where the spirits of the virtuous go after death. And so this becomes a notion that gets brought in with popular Buddhism, and then it becomes a notion in lots of like pop religious traditions in China. But the earliest notion of heaven or Tian as a philosophical concept seems to be the notion of a higher power, which may be more or less anthropocentric, depending on the thinker, and more or less connected with a teleological view of the universe. So I'd say for early thinkers, Confucius, heaven is not particularly anthropomorphic. So it's not that much like a human being, but it is a higher power and it's on the side of morality. So it's part of a teleological conception of the universe. And then for the Moists, I think one way of reading it is the Moists are hearkening back to a more fundamentalist, or they might say more originalist interpretation of heaven as being very anthropomorphic. And heaven is like speaking to people through ghosts and spirits and actually sending ghosts and spirits to punish people or to reward people for either bad or good behavior, respectively. And then in Zhuangzi seems to suggest that heaven isn't really concerned with human values. And one way of looking at Zhuangzi is saying, well, from the perspective of heaven, benevolence and righteousness, these are just like the peepings of little birds. You know, they're what little birds they peep. Human beings talk about benevolence and righteousness, but that doesn't reflect heaven's perspective. That reflects what the particular animal type, you know, tends to do. And the sage is the one who recognizes that the tianli, the heavenly pattern, is not the same as the values that human beings ordinarily express. And then, interestingly, you could read Xunzi as a Confucian who says, well, you're right, heaven is not on the side of human right and wrong, but humans are the kinds of creatures who engage in the fabrication of new and original things and transform themselves. And that's what's really distinctive about human beings. And if we create morality, we can create something that will make life better for humans from our human perspective. And so that's why we create morality and transform ourselves in the light of it, not because heaven's on the side of it. So you get this interesting way in which Xunzi has read earlier thinkers and is actually in some ways more in line with Zhuangzi's amoral, or naturalistic seems to me a little weird to use because these guys didn't have natural science. So not naturalistic in our sense, but in a sense, a kind of naturalistic conception of the universe where the universe is indifferent to human values. And Zhuangzi says, yeah, so transcend human values. And Shunzi says, wait a second, we're the kind of creatures who artificially create values, so that's what we should do. This is what it is to be a human. And then it seems like when we get into the Han Dynasty with people like Dong Zhongshu, they turn their back on the Shunzian conception of heaven. And Dong Zhongshu ends up saying, oh, heaven sends down warnings and omens to let you know whether you're doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And so we get a more anthropomorphic, or at least a more value-laden conception of heaven, again, in the Han Dynasty.
So we've just had a chance to look at a lot of different topics across Warring States philosophy. And I guess that anyone who's still listening to this episode, since we've been talking for almost an hour, is someone who is convinced that Chinese philosophy is worth being interested in. So we probably don't need to convince them of that. But Bryan, since you are the co-author of a book that really made the case for integrating non-Western philosophy into the study and research of philosophy, I was wondering, maybe I could ask you to give us your best case for the arguments that people who agree with you should use if they're talking to skeptics. Because I think we're probably preaching to the choir here, right? We're talking to people who agree with us that Chinese philosophy is interesting. But what should people like that say to people who think, oh, no, philosophy is only Western, or actually Chinese philosophy is optional. We don't need to include it. It's fine if you want to, but you don't need to. What would you say to someone like that?
Many years ago now, I co-wrote an op-ed in the New York Times with my friend and colleague Jay Garfield, in which we argued that if philosophy departments in the English-speaking world only are going to teach the Anglo-European philosophical tradition, they should just change their names to departments of Western philosophy to just be honest about what they're doing. And it received a surprisingly, both many people very much in favor of what we were saying, that we should open the curriculum, but also other people saying that we were wrong for failing to recognize the intrinsic superiority of Western philosophy. And then Columbia University Press invited both of us to write a book about this, and Jay was too busy to co-write it, but I wrote Taking Back Philosophy, a Multicultural Manifesto, and Jay very generously wrote a foreword, and the foreword is one of the best parts of the book, in my opinion. Jay did a really good job in it. And part of what I do in the book is address some of the arguments against expanding the canon to include Chinese philosophy, as well as Indian philosophy, African philosophy, Indigenous American philosophy, and give some of the arguments in favor of it. So just really quickly, one just simple strategic reason for wanting to learn about Chinese philosophy is that China is incredibly influential in the world today. And under Mao Zedong, Confucius was rejected as a decadent part of China's feudal past. But under China's contemporary ruler, Xi Jinping, he says that the Chinese Communist Party is the true inheritor of the Confucian tradition and the true protector of that tradition. And so if you want to understand the other great superpower in the world today, China, it's worthwhile learning something about the Chinese tradition and trying to understand it more deeply. I went to Stanford for graduate school, and one of the things I discovered was that the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, which is a right-wing think tank, has a really first-rate collection of Chinese communist writings. And I actually asked one of my teachers, why does the Hoover Institution, this right-wing think tank, have this great collection of Chinese communist writing? And it's like, just because you're right-wing doesn't mean you should be ignorant of the people you're arguing against. And there's an earlier, people I think are losing sight of the fact the classical conservative tradition was, no, you need to understand what people you disagree with think. And so it's important for us to know about Chinese thought, in part because of the importance of China in the world today. Another reason is simply that Chinese philosophy, as we've seen today, is really just very interesting and philosophically profound. And if you're serious about learning about philosophy, why would you ignore an entire tradition that has really interesting ideas that are relevant to topics you're talking about? So, for example, in this over my career, virtue ethics has seen a revival of interest. It goes back, many people would say, to Anscombe's article, Modern Moral Philosophy, and then Alistair MacIntyre's seminal work, After Virtue. But to this day, the paradigm people often use for virtue ethics is Aristotelian virtue ethics. Now, I think Aristotelian virtue ethics is really interesting, but Confucianism offers alternative formulations of virtue ethics that I think in many ways are much more plausible. Now, this gets us into yet another issue, which is there are some philosophers who say, well, I don't care about the history of philosophy, whether it's Western philosophy or Chinese philosophy. So sometimes we have to deal with the people who just don't want to look at the history of philosophy at all. But I'd say anytime you write or think, you're doing so against a background of views that limit what is possible for you to see. And looking at another tradition will open you up to new possibilities. I've often given talks about the problem of akrasia, or weakness of will, in Confucian thought. And I've had Western philosophers tell me, I think I understand better what Aristotle is saying about weakness of will now that I understand what Confucian thinkers say about it. It helps me triangulate better what I think Aristotle thought about that. And I think the conception of the virtues and of ethical cultivation that you get in the great Confucian thinker Mengzi is frankly much more plausible than the view that you get in Aristotle, which I think Aristotle's view of ethical cultivation it's evocative, but I think it's often obscure. And I think Mengzi gives you a much clearer view of that. Another issue that I think is really interesting is the nature of the self. And I think oftentimes Western philosophers, although they recognize there are paradoxes here, they often take it for granted that the universe has to, at some level, consist of distinct individuals. And then the problem becomes figuring out, well, since we're all distinct individuals, why should we work together in society? And I think the Chinese philosophers very commonly offer an alternative perspective where they say, well, no, individuals are parts of larger wholes. And once you start to recognize that, it really influences how you think about both ethics and political philosophy. And you start to realize it's maybe a more plausible kind of view. I sometimes say about Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, I say, Hobbes is the smartest dumb guy I've ever read. Because the overall view, the radical individualist view you get of political philosophy in Hobbes' Leviathan, there's a kind of genius in the way he's carried it out to its logical conclusion, but the starting premises are just crazy. That we're just like these kind of atomic individuals and we're in a war of all against all. And the Confucian view is like, well, no, we're primarily social creatures. And then the question is, well, since we're social creatures, how do we work together most effectively in a way that respects individual differences and the need for individuals to cultivate themselves and recognizes that individuals sometimes have responsibilities that may be different from their responsibilities as members of the community. So I think there's really a rich range of topics that people can learn from in Chinese philosophy. So there are both practical reasons for learning about Chinese philosophy, and there are just good philosophical reasons for wanting to learn about it. And then the last thing I'll just say about that is to point out that when Westerners first learned about Chinese philosophy, they were very enthusiastic about it. People like Christian Wolff, who's not as well known today, but was a major figure in the German Enlightenment, was a huge fan of Confucianism. And Leibniz, who's a standard figure on any history of modern Western philosophy curriculum, was a huge Sinophile. And both of them, along with many others, were excited about Chinese thought. And it's only with the development of pseudo-scientific racism that was used as a rationalization for Western imperialism that Chinese philosophy was written out of the curriculum. And Peter K.J. Park has a great book about this, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, Racism in the Western Philosophical Canon, where he documents this at length. So if you assume there is no such thing as African or Indian or Chinese or indigenous American philosophy, remember that is not some a priori truth. That is something that people came to believe as a result of things like Western imperialism and pseudoscientific racism.
And actually as a backlash against the period where, as you just said, there was actually a lot of enthusiasm and interest for
Yeah.
Chinese philosophy, also Indian philosophy. So, Karyn, do you want to give us a final thought or maybe question before we wrap up?
A final thought, I think, completely agree with Bryan's comments about the value of understanding philosophy in non-Western traditions and in broadening our scope, our understanding of, after all, what humanity is all about. I think in philosophy, we often assume that our primary preoccupation is with ideas. So when you open up yourself to non-Western traditions, you're also embracing learning about new ideas, perhaps embracing them, perhaps rejecting them, engaging with them, etc. One of the things I've found myself enjoying tremendously in working in comparative philosophy is thinking about the argumentative methods that these different traditions use. And I think we often forget that the philosophical methods are just as diversified as ideas might be. And in the early days, when people started studying Chinese philosophy in English, there were attempts to classify Chinese philosophy using the terms of reference that were available in Anglophone philosophy. Ethics is one, for instance, and the way in which people might think, oh, Chinese philosophy is just ethics, where's the metaphysics? Warring States philosophy, where in particular is cosmology, where's the metaphysics? But I think when we say we want to let certain philosophical traditions speak up and speak for themselves, we need to look not just for the ideas, but also the methods with which those ideas are established.
Yeah, there's nothing in Greek philosophy quite like the Zhuangzi, for example.
But if we look at the broad range of ideas, maybe Nietzsche, in terms of his style and some of his writings, is like Zhuangzi. And sometimes, and this ties into the general topic, sometimes people will say, well, Chinese philosophy, it's all just like aphoristic statements. And I always say, yeah, like the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus and or Pascal's Pensée. But as we all know, no, Chinese philosophy is not all just aphorisms. There are philosophical dialogues, there are philosophical essays, a lot of philosophy is done in the form of commentary, and you find analogs of all of these genres in Western philosophy.
Yeah.
And so there's a tendency, I think, for people to look at what have Western philosophers or English language philosophers done in the last 50 years. That's what philosophy is. No, that the last 50 years have been a weird period in Anglo-American philosophy. And so that's not representative of most of what people have been doing for the last 2,000 plus years in the Western tradition. And you see a variety of things that have been philosophy in the West. You see a variety of things that have been philosophy in China.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing we should have learned already from the last 50 episodes is if anyone ever says Chinese philosophy is all just X, like it's all just ethics or it's all just aphorisms or whatever, that's always going to be wrong. And as we move forward, we'll see even more diversity in Chinese philosophy. So what we're going to be moving on to next is actually not quite yet the Han period, because we are not finished with Warring States philosophy yet. We still have to do legalism. So that's what's coming. For now, though, I will thank Bryan van Norden very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks, Karyn, for joining us, as always.
Glad to be here.
And thanks for doing this with me, as always. And please join me, oh dear audience, the next time as we start to move on to think about legalism here on the History of Philosophy in China.